Hi, everyone. My name is Benno Papari, and this is the Songwriters on Process podcast. Since 2010, I've interviewed over 300 songwriters about, well, their songwriting process. I don't care about favorite cities, tour stories, favorite foods, or anything like that. My goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat poets and more traditional prose writers. They are writers, plain and simple. In these interviews, we go deep into the specifics of the writing process. This is no, hey, do you start with the lyrics of the music type of interview. Now, a little bit about me. I'm not a songwriter. In fact, I've never written a song in my life. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a former academic. So as a prose writer, I enjoy exploring how my process intersects with those of songwriters. This is an intelligent conversation about writing between two writers, and that, of course, means we talk a lot about books. The site features interviews across all genres, from metal to jazz, from country to that big category known as indie. You'll find a couple of A-list actors on the site and several members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as well. Now, I select songwriters to interview who fit into one of two categories. One, do I listen to them already? And two, if I don't, would they make for a compelling and intelligent interview? You can find these interviews across all podcast platforms as well as at songwritersonpodcast.com. Do you have an idea for an interview or a comment about the site? Hit me up at ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Thanks for listening and enjoy. And today we have Evan Lewis and Tom McGreevy of Ducks Limited. But first, an important announcement. I've been waiting patiently several months to tell you this, and finally I can say it because it came out this week. I have a book coming out with my good friend Mark Morton, one of the guitarists in the band Lamb of God. Mark is a good friend of mine, and we collaborated on his memoir, and that is called Desolation, a heavy metal memoir, out June 25th on Hachette Books. Took us, this is a couple of years in the making, and we worked very hard on this, and I am biased, of course, but it's a great book. Mark has a great story. Regardless if you're a fan of the band or not, it's a great story about recovery, tragedy, happiness. This is not your typical, I say this really, having read many of these memoirs, this is not your typical rock star memoir of the drugs and the partying and all that. It's much more than that. And I think no matter what your story is, I think there's universality in Mark's story. So anyway, if you may have seen, Rolling Stone did a nice feature on this last week, and it's all over the place. You can pre-order it on all the major sites. Again, it is called Desolation, a heavy metal memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. You'll be hearing that again for a few more months. But I'll stop now. Let's talk about today's podcast again with Evan Lewis and Tom McGreevy at Ducks Limited. I'm very happy to say that during this episode, you will not hear the term jangle pop once. Their new album, Harm's Way, is excellent. I think I would love to see if Rolling Blackout's Coastal Fever, if they're still touring, I'd love to see, that would be a great show, Ducks Limited and Rolling Blackout's Coastal Fever. But anyway, back to Ducks. I'm a big fan of this new album, Harm's Way. I think if I can sum this up, it would be opposites attract. And I will just tell you two quotes, and this is probably all you need to know. Evan said, the writing process should be a disaster. That's, all over the place, messiness, chaos, no order. That's Evan's view. And here's Tom's. This is what Tom does. When he writes, he sends emails to himself with lyrics and then edits them that way. So he'll send a set of lyrics to himself, open the email, make revisions, send that to himself. And he does that over and over. 10, maybe 20 times, just resends the lyrics, but each time with a different edit. And that way he sees the edit history. That's very old school. I feel like there's other more simplified, more modern ways to do that, but that's the way he's always done it. I loved that story. I've never heard that before, but wow, talk about a difference. We have someone who says the process should be chaotic, and we have someone who sends emails to himself with the lyrics, and that's his editing process. So that's probably pretty reflective of how they work. Listen, it works because I love this album. Again, it's called Harm's Way. So I'll let you take a listen anyway with Evan Lewis and Tom McGreevy of Ducks Limited. Let's get started. So Tom, we'll start with you. Are you a create every day type of person, or, and it can be any type of writing, whether it's songwriting or otherwise, or do you feel like it's more effective just to create when the mood strikes?
Yeah, I wish I was more disciplined, but I not even vaguely a create everyday person. Like I lucky if I do it once a week. Like I try and I find that like when we kind of have something that we're working on, I'll be more productive more consistently. But yeah, generally speaking, it's sort of like like I find that if I do kind of get in the mentality of like grinding that can actually be kind of useful. Not in that I make something that's like worth the damn on any given day, but that like I'll find that like sometimes the ideas that like spurs up will kind of like become useful later. Or sometimes I just feel like it's like you kind of have to write the bad stuff sometimes to get to the good stuff. But yeah, I'm unfortunately a little bit more sporadic than I would like to be.
So after a week, do you start to get anxious thinking, oh shit, it's been a week. I really should start to get something down.
Yeah, I mean, I think like yeah, but whether or not that actually gets me to do it is a different question. Like I definitely like yeah, I feel when I'm not doing it, I feel like guilty. But I find that it also is like not yeah, it's just like it's if I sit down and try and work on something when my mind is elsewhere, it is not typically a very productive time. So,
So are there things that you do if you find that it's not happening? Are there techniques you use to force yourself to sit down and say, I just have to get this done?
sometimes, but I think it's just like I think more often than not, it's like you sit down and it's just like, okay, like this isn't gonna happen right now. And I find like sometimes those attempts like do end up being useful. Like you know, you find something that's like the a kernel of an idea that you can go back to at a future date. But yeah, I think sometimes that's just like got to be part of it. Is just accepting that you know sometimes it's not your day.
Yeah. Evan, how about you? Are you a create everyday type of person, or it's just when the mood strikes?
I think just when the mood strikes, I think, yeah, it's interesting in the context of this band because, yeah, eventually we'll get kind of a deadline or that we're creating an album. And then that kind of inspires. And I feel like the time before that, you're maybe, listening to music, fiddling every now and again, but not consciously writing. And then when you've got something that you're working towards, that's when it kind of like kicks into gear in your brain, even when you're not necessarily being creative, is thinking about different ideas and things like that. So it's like I don't know. That always seems to be useful. And then Tom and I will arrange like, hey, next Tuesday we're meeting up. So then it's like, well, we've got to have something to bring to that session. So yeah, that'll usually spark it.
So,
Uh,
so sorry. So are deadlines good? Like I find for me false, like it's funny you say that. So I will create, and I'm a prose writer, not a songwriter, but I will intentionally create false deadlines. So for example, I'll say, if I have a, meeting at 12, I won't start writing until 11. What I'm writing has nothing to do with that meeting, but it's still a hard stop. And I find that that's doesn't make me anxious. It actually makes me more productive if I feel like, okay, I have to be done in an hour because I have something else to do. So our deadlines, are they, it sounds like they're productive for you.
Extremely productive, I think. Yeah. It's like having deadlines, and then even if you've just got a few minutes, like fiddling with an instrument or humming a melody and just like saving it as a quick note in your phone, you might not think it's very good, but then later when you do have some more time to sit down and be creative, you can go back through those things and be like, oh, actually, that's kind of cool when you can hear it kind of outside of your own head.
So I want to get both of your takes on this, but Evan, we'll stick with you because you did mention phones, and I find that songwriters typically have hundreds of voice memos on their phones with no sense of organization whatsoever. And they frantically go back and look for that idea that they don't know when it happened and there's no organization. It is rare the songwriter who says, oh, yes, they're all wonderfully organized. So, Evan, Do you have all those voice memos on their phones, and is there any sense of organization to them?
There's absolutely no organization. The closest thing that I started doing was giving them maybe like evoked the feeling of them. So later I'd be like, oh, what's this? This little thing called this. I don't remember any examples, but no, I think it's best to be like messy with all this stuff. Just like do it kind of scattered, and then when you come back to it, it's just by chance you'll hear it. Like when your brain starts organizing them all and thinking about them too much, you might focus on a bad idea that you think is cool for too long and spend too much time working on it. I think it's good to have like chance encounters with these things and just make lots of them and not be too like precious about them.
So the messiness is effective then.
Yeah, I think it's like the artist's job sometimes to like have these messy things, and you're an editor that whittles them down, and then the final thing you present to people is neat and organized. But I think the process of making it should be an absolute disaster. I can't remember who I heard talking about. It's like a kitchen, at a restaurant where the kitchen's like an absolute chaotic mess, but they're creating the food. And then when the food comes out, it's like, on this plate and it looks beautiful. And the people in the restaurant, I think everything's, done perfectly, but the people in the kitchen are like going crazy,
And I also think though that the advantage of that is that if they're not organized, then it forces you to look at every one, and that one that maybe didn't seem important originally, you may look at it with some distance and say, well, actually, that may have some legs to it. But if there was organization, you might skip over it otherwise. So by forcing yourself to go through every one, right, you may see that idea that you may have overlooked if it were organized.
Yeah, totally.
Tom, how about you? Is there any sense of organization? I'm assuming you have voice memos, right, of all of those things.
Yeah. The voice memos are less ordered typically because they're just sort of like half ideas. And I think often like for me, they're almost like a test. Like it's like it's honestly pretty rare that I'll go back to a voice memo that like didn't stick with me otherwise. Like it's like if I come up with half an idea and I organize it enough in my head to record it into my phone, then it normally will have like, if it's any good, it will have like lodged itself in my brain in some way. And I like will then be able to like, then I will continue thinking about it. Like there have probably been some exceptions, but for the most part, it's like, or I think the exception will often be there will be some subtlety in the memo that I will lose, and then I have to go back to it to be like, oh no, that melody is actually like doing something a little bit different than I thought it was, or like there's like some small thing in it that I like the magic has left it and I can't find it, and that's what it was. It was in the memo. But yeah, like I there definitely isn't a structure to that. There's like some parts of that kind of stuff where I do have like a really rigorous structure, like with lyric, and like that is aided by technology. Like with lyric writing, I have like I tend to do them as like emails to myself where I reply with the edits. So they'll just be like 20 emails long with just like small little iterative changes, because then I can go back and be like, oh no, it was better before, and I have them all like in front of me and I can just like scroll up and down it.
I'm speechless only because I've done this so many times. I've never heard that before. And what I love hearing are things that no one has ever done. Okay, so let me get this straight, because I could go on this for days. So, okay, so what you do is you just send yourself emails, and then you see, by replying, you see what you previously said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so my response to that is, why not just make like a Word doc with all of those things? How did you get into replying to yourself over emails?
It's because I always have access to it. Like it's like I have my emails like on my laptop, but also on my phone. And so it's like if I like have an idea, or if I'm thinking about something, because I feel like I'll be working on something at home, and then I'll like leave to go somewhere and I'll still be thinking about it. And that's often I feel like when I kind of make either my best or worst decisions with it, is when I'm like still ruminating on it. And then like what I've learned, I think, about that is that like it, like, because those decisions are either good or bad, it helps to have it in a record like that where I can just like look back on it, but be able to make those changes quickly. So I'll have the thought, and it's always like the way that I tend to write stuff is it's like I'll change them a lot. Like I'll edit the lyrics like really granularly, just like on word by word basis, like little things that I'll change to make it kind of fit and flow better. And so when I have like that in an email form, I can make those little changes as they occur to me, and then like look back on them later and kind of compare them and think about them in like in order, where each one is like is a moment in time. Each one is like an entry that I had into this sort of log in that moment.
Okay, so how did you even think of this? Like, because I love that idea. I think it makes so much sense, but I would never think to my like that. How did you even have that idea? Did that come from something else, like outside of songwriting?
I don't think so. I think I started doing it. Like I think I started emailing them to myself because we always like demo. Well, like more recently we do it at like our studio, but we always used to do it at Evan's house. And so the easiest way for me to have the lyrics on me was to write them in an email. Cause then it's like, if I just, when I go over to Evan's, like they're just there and it's easy for me to find. And so like that was kind of I think how I started doing it. And then I kind of realized that there was a utility in doing it this way too.
Wow. I've never heard that. I love that answer only because, like I said, I love hearing things that no one's ever said before. And I just think, in this age of, right. And Evan, I guess my thought is that's the exact opposite of messiness. Like that's so orderly. And Evan, it sounds like you are the exact opposite. Like you intentionally want things to be messy in the process, right? So I imagine you're not sending yourself emails of ideas, right?
No, and I guess the difference here is like mine is usually like guitar parts, whereas Tom's lyrics. So a bit different. But yeah, I just want to chance encounter these things and have a reaction to it, and then I'll know if it's good or bad. Like sometimes if you're walking and you're, distracted and you just hear it and you're like, oh, that's actually really cool, then I'll make a note of that and be like, okay, we should put that in the song somewhere.
So do you, when you have ideas then, do you intentionally give yourself distance? So I will give you an example. I love to kind of reference other songwriters I've interviewed. So I interviewed Mary Timony about a month ago, and she said what she does is she does stuff in the morning. She always hates it. And then she intentionally looks at it later that day, and she says, because at the end of the day, it's someone else. Like she says, she's a different person. Like it's a different person looking at it in the evening as opposed to the morning. And so that's, so she goes about her day, doesn't think about it at all. And then at the end of the day, it's like, oh, here's this thing, who wrote this? And that's kind of her ideal. So do you give yourself distance with those ideas to kind of look at them from different perspectives?
Yeah, and I try to jot them down really quick and not think. It's like trying to beat your critical brain, because I know the second my critical brain comes in, it'll ruin it in some way. I've kind of learned that through experience. Is if I labor over something forever thinking that it's clever or it's based on something else that I like, it's overthought and it's bad. But sometimes I'll just have this quick melody in my head and I'll jot it down on guitar and I'll make a voice note, and then I'll hear it 3 months later completely out of context of knowing what it was, and I'll be like, oh, that's really cool. And maybe I played it bad, and then there's an imperfection in how I played it that sounds cool, and then we'll incorporate that into the song. Which I think that happened a few times on this album, where it was like the first time we ever played the parts were kind of played naively and incorrect, and then we had re-recorded them, but then we're like, oh, it was so much cooler in the demo, and then kind of had to learn how to play it badly, like someone just jotting down a scrappy idea.
Yeah, like I feel like there was a bunch of stuff on this one where there was sort of like unconscious rhythmic stuff that as soon as we tried to like play it accurately, we lost it. And it's like, no, like there was like something being swung weirdly in that was what made the whole thing work. Like,
and I love also the idea that, in order to really look at something accurately, like you said, like Evan, you said, my critical brain, it's almost like that's a different person, right? And it's almost like we have to perceive ourselves as someone else in order to, and that's what Mary Timony was saying too. I think that to really be a good editor, you have to, and I've had other songwriters, like one songwriter told me, I forgot who it was, Matt Nathanson, said that it was he calls it the assassin. The assassin is, he's named his editor because the assassin is the person over his shoulder that says, "What are you doing? That's horrible." But I love that idea of the other kind of is the one that's making those changes, and I think that comes with distance.
Yeah. And that we're lucky for, the two of us. So it's like you've always got someone who will, if you think something's bad, but the other one's like, no, it's actually really good, you can trust them. So it's like we have that advantage. It's so much harder to do it completely on your own. I admire anyone who can do that,
But I think that's what they do. I think when they're on their own, they pretend they are two different people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the sense I'm getting then is distance is the key, that looking at something too soon after you write anything isn't the best way to go, right? The more distance, the better.
I think so. And I think we've even experienced that we're now starting to play this album live and you hearing it through a different lens now because you also know what the audience is reacting to, and you just start to hear it differently than you did when you heard it 500 times while you were recording it, and the ones that you thought were good are maybe not the ones that people like as much. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Tom, what were you gonna say?
Oh yeah, I think there's an element with the distance thing too, where I think like often when writing something, there's a sort of like natural inclination to sort of like seek like the juice, like the dopamine hit that happens sometimes when it's working and it's easy. And it's like that happens sometimes. And it's like, I think like sometimes when you're writing and you're not getting that, it's hard to be aware of the fact that you're maybe actually doing something that's valid and valuable until you come back to it. Because it's like I feel like, yeah, it's like there's some certain songs that I remember writing where it was just like, it felt great and it was working. There are far more instances where it felt awful. But then I like assess it at a later date and it's like, no, that's something there. There's something like worth, pursuing. And I think it's like, it's sometimes hard to separate those two feelings, I think, in the moment.
So when you're feeling awful though, how do you push through? I mean, my thought would be, if I'm not feeling it, I'm going to stop. But it sounds like you, even when it feels awful or it sounds awful, you still push through though.
I mean, I think I will in the moment, and I'll try and get like to the end of something. Like I'll try and complete like some shape of the idea, and then often find myself in a spot where I think that where I maybe don't believe in it, but then that's like kind of where the distance comes in. I come back to it, and it's like, oh no, there is something there. Like it needs to be fixed. It needs to be some things that need to be straightened out with it. I need to continue working on parts of it, which was maybe why it didn't like feel good initially. But there's a core of something there that is like worth pursuing still,
So I'm guessing I know the answer to this, but do you ever write lyrics with a pen and paper, or are you strictly keyboard person?
I have done it. It's not normally how it works best for me, just because I like my handwriting is terrible. I'm very comfortable on a keyboard. I am far less comfortable writing something down, and I find the ability to sort of quickly edit like text in front of me in a keyboard context is definitely helpful. But I feel like I do it. I sometimes do it when I'm like feel stuck. I'll just like try and change an element, like be like, okay, like I'm gonna do this differently and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I 100%. When I was teaching, I would tell my students, and the same way. And it's funny, the same thing about how if you find that it's not happening, use a pen and paper. I know they've done studies with university students, and they found that students who take notes with a pen and paper have greater recall than students who take notes on computer, because I think it involves a different part of the brain. So there's something I think to that. That maybe that, and as far as songwriting though, maybe it's some kind of emotional connection. I do think though that it's a different part of the brain, if I recall, and that's why, when you have like writer's block or something, using a pen and paper just to get ideas down can be effective.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff like that. I feel like it always feels kind of silly, like that it has like some like mystic property that I can't like quite go with. But I often find that if I'm like stuck with stuff, just switching guitars sometimes makes a difference. Just like being like, oh, this one's different. It's got like even if it's like functionally the same instrument, it's like I will just be like, if I change it up, I'll find something else, you know?
But that's very, I mean, if you listen to what prose writers say, a prose writer will never say, if you're stuck, just stare at the screen forever. It'll come. I mean, the first thing you should do is go to another room, go to another chair, anything like that. I mean, the last thing you want to do is stay in that same place.
Mhm.
So, yeah, Evan. All right. So let's go to you on this. So I'm curious about the ritual of the process when you create. If you, is there a time of day, things you have to have with you, maybe rooms, favorite room, favorite chair? I have my favorite places and things that I find are more productive, but how important is that idea of the ritual to you?
In the context of Ducks, I guess we very much have like kind of a structure and a ritual and a little studio set up that we always come to. So I guess once we have an idea, like Tom will basically make a phone demo that's just him and a guitar playing the song. So the song exists. And then I would say we kind of have a ritual and a place, and we have instruments that, over the years we know work and sound like our band. So I guess we've kind of like got a bit of a process and a place. But I think it is good to like shake it up every now and again. And definitely, I know Tom wrote a lot of this last record on the road in certain places. So somewhat for the like recording and the writing of all the instruments and melodies, there's a bit of a ritual. But for the song itself, I feel like can kind of come from anywhere.
Well, Evan, do you think that for you at least, are you more? Do the ideas come? Are you a morning person, evening person, night person? Do you find that they are happening more often than others a certain time of day?
Probably the best ideas come in the morning, I think, but we mainly work on our songs in the evening.
Ooh, I like that. Now define morning, because some songwriters morning's like 11:30 in the morning. So what is morning to you?
Yeah, like, and it's probably based around I have one coffee a day and it's at like 11, so I'm probably getting some kind of hit and I feel my mood is good and it's just like, okay, everything's fine. And then you can ride in that little moment, which at night you're getting tired. And
It's funny because when I ask songwriters that question who have kids, morning is like 5 o'clock in the morning. If 6 o'clock in the morning, it's very different. So actually, Tom, before we get to you, Evan, I do want to follow up something you just said. So can you write? I think when you said when you're feeling good, I think were your words or something like that.
Yeah.
When you're most productive. So, is there an ideal emotion? Do you find that not feeling good, sadness, melancholy, that kind, is that a productive place to write from, or never?
Never. For me, yeah, again, comes back to the critical brain thing. Like I'm too hard on myself and I'm aware of it. So it's like the moments where I'm not being hard on myself, I can at least like amass a bunch of ideas that then later I can come back and listen to, and that's okay. But I'll get to these points where I'll beat myself up or something, So it's good to just get to these moments where I'm feeling good and I can just like, I'll just write 3 songs right now. And if they suck, I don't have to ever show them to anyone. But well, let's just try it, And usually those are the most productive moments.
I wish I could remember the songwriter who told me this, who said that they like to write in a happy place, but they have to be cranky when they edit, because when they're cranky, that's when they're at their most critical.
Yeah, it's like I think, we have solidified our music taste at this point. So you can kind of listen to your thing. You just want to like finish the whole idea, like you want to see through a whole song in some capacity. So at least it exists. If you just write a verse or you just write a chorus or a guitar line or something, sometimes it's really hard to come back to that and like add other parts to it. So I think the goal is like try and at least have like a verse and a chorus, melody, not so much lyrics for me, and then have that solidified as an idea and then, capture that in some moments and then later you can come back to it. But times where I've maybe just had a chorus that was good, it's been really hard to attach it to something else. So yeah, the skill for me is just like beating that moment where my brain is like, this is bad, or you should stop. Like, you're not good at this, you know?
Right. All right, Tom, how about you? The idea of the ritual of the process. Is there a, when you are writing those lyrics or when you're by yourself, is there a certain time of day, place, things you have to have with you to just be your most productive?
I mean, I think it's pretty variable. I think like the majority of like my writing happens kind of at home in the evenings. But there's also like a lot of stuff where it's kind of come to me somewhere else, or like I'll sometimes like I'll have like the basic idea when I'm just like out somewhere. I like honestly like it shows a lot. Like if I'm seeing a band, like that'll sometimes be like I'll just like be like, oh, like that's like I'll have a thought often like unrelated to the thing I'm seeing. Like and like they'll like kind of like find the core of an idea when I'm like watching somebody else do something. And then like we'll like kind of go back and examine it later. Um it's like pretty variable. Like some and like it's also sometimes it's like I'm doing the like the sit down and try and write something thing, and then sometimes it's like, like being in like an MGM musical and I just like feel a song coming on. Um like that's like that's how it goes. Like so it's like it is definitely like that can be like that can dictate context a little bit.
Another thing I've never heard before, MGM musical. Two things I've never heard before in interviews. So, or that comparison at least. That's great. So I've got some quotes up here on my screen from writers. These are prose writers, and I want to get your take, both of your takes on how this would relate to songwriting. And I think we've kind of alluded to these things already. So, but some of these I think really are spot on with what we've talked about today. So, Tom, we'll start with you. So, this is one of my favorites by E.L. Doctorow, the novelist. He says, writing, and I'll repeat this, writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. I love that. I'm going to read that again one more time. Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. So go ahead, respond to that. I can tell you're about to.
That's real good. I like that a lot. That's I feel like that's a question that like a question that I get asked a lot. It's where like people like sort of like will ask me about like my intent with a song, like what I was like, and it's and the answer is like I have no idea. Like it's like I found out as I was doing it, like what I was doing, and like that's like kind of I think the part of it that I find it often the most interesting is that you're sort of like you're trying to like carve a sculpture blindfolded or something, and it's like that's like the like you find out what you were doing as you do it, and then like I think are become capable of as the picture becomes clearer, or at least for me in a sort of like a conscious way, then you kind of like you realize where you have opportunities to sort of like direct the process and to shape it and to be purposeful and to have more intent. And like I feel like the more I've done it, the more I can kind of like conjure that element of the process even when I am arriving with intent. But a lot of it has to, I think, be this, this exact thing of like of you're just sort of moving into the space ahead of you and trying to work out from that. So that's a good quote.
It's not, no, that's the songwriters. That's their favorite. And I for me, at least, I find that, and I agree. I don't think I have any right knowing what something is supposed to look like when I start. Like, I don't think I have any right knowing. I know. And I think that the biggest, at least as a prose writer, the biggest, mistake you can make is say, I'm here now. Here's where I want to be at the end, and that's how I'm going to get there. It doesn't allow you, for any kind of like, not knowing where that's going to lead you. Where is that next hallway? Where is that next corner? So I agree 100%. But Evan, how about you? How do you feel about that? Are you kind of the same way?
Yeah, similar thing, and just like see how it goes, follow the process, react to your last move, and just keep going. And then, at the end, you'll have a finished product, which is kind of always amazing. And like the process of it is the joy of it, is like this unknown, like, you know, what is this thing we're making? And then you finish it and you've got to this point where you're like, okay, there's no more parts or changes or things we need to do to it, and it's fully formed. But yeah, you sometimes, like, especially when I was younger, you read these books about these people who just seem to have, like, you know, a song came to me in my sleep and I just woke up and I wrote it down and it was fully there. And it was this huge hit. And you're like, fuck off. Like, and then you think that there's these people that are like enchanted and more special than others. But really, it's just like doing the work and doing it a lot. And then you'll end up making a lot of stuff as long as you do. But yeah, sometimes it's a really like painful process, but just seeing it through and reacting to the last decision, and yeah, you'll eventually have a whole bunch of stuff that you did and you'll be surprised.
All right. So Evan, we'll stick with you. So this is a quote by Agatha Christie, the writer. She said, the best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes. I always take that to mean that our best ideas come to us during periods of monotonous activities. And that's very common with songwriters, that they get ideas when they are doing things that require no conscious thought. Doing the dishes, gardening, folding laundry, anything that doesn't require conscious thought, that allows the unconscious to bubble up. And there was an article in the Washington Post within the past year about why we get our best ideas in the shower.
Yeah.
And that's why. It's because your brain is doing something that requires you can literally do in your sleep. So, Evan, for you, and then we'll go to Tom, but do you get ideas in period when you're engaged in monotonous activities?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's so true. Like driving is a big one. Sometimes like moving a lot, I find. So I'm like on a bike or I'm walking or even like running. Yeah, I think that's so true. And again, I think it goes back to that critical brain. You've like got that thing occupied doing its thing, and then you can be free to kind of daydream and, you know, come up with your ideas and let them become fully realized. I think that's really, really true.
And I'd like to explore at some point, this is a far deeper discussion to have about if during movement, so there's two types of movement. There's the movement where something else is propelling you, like a car, bus, plane, something like that, or self-propelling, walking, biking, stuff like running, stuff like that. I'd love to know. And again, we don't have to, I'm curious about that, just if those ideas are different, you know, because that's two different types of motion. Like, is there some more, does running or maybe flying driving or because you're covering greater distances when you're driving or flying or whatever, make you more reflective? I don't know. Do we have an answer? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. Tom has an answer.
Oh, I definitely wrote a lot of this. I'm realizing like a lot of the songs from this record were in cars, and I'm not sure whether or not that is a testament, like that may be in part a testament to how much time we spent in cars over the last like year or so. But yeah, like now I'm thinking of it, it's like the core idea of the main thing was written in a car. Cathedral City was written almost entirely in a car.
You driving or you were a passenger at the time?
A mix, but in cars the whole time. Yeah, there's like a bunch of it that was what was written that way. Yeah, no, there is something to that. I feel like the motion thing, or the fact that like there's a bunch of stimulus, but stimulus you can kind of tune out. Like,
Evan, you just blew my mind. Now I got to think about whether it's different whether you're driving or as a passenger. I didn't even think about that, and now you brought that up, and that's a whole. It's funny when you said that. My first thought is when you're driving, it's like that highway hypnosis thing. I don't know that you get it when you're a passenger, but when you're driving, you could drive a couple miles and feel like I don't even remember those past 2 minutes. I don't know, but that's so interesting that you said that, whether that would even be a difference.
Totally. And I've even like realized, because we did so much driving, that even just like my general anxiety, as long as we're not like in a high traffic city area or something, I just experience way less anxiety while I'm driving in general.
Yeah.
Just I feel calm, which is maybe linked to this same mental state.
Yeah. Tom, what about you? Look, you say something.
I think I actually think about it. I think part of it for me is that I'm like generally very ADD, and so like when I'm in a car, whether I'm driving or not, the number of things I could be doing is like significantly lessened. So it's like it won't it like I will not get off track in the same way I can I can sit with an idea in a way that like I might not if I'm like in my house with all my stuff like.
Yeah. And also, this practically, if you're driving or or on the road, you may see things that will give you an idea. Could be a billboard or something like that, where you think, "Wow, I've heard that too." All of those things, but yeah, the monotony is a fruitful time, right? Just when your brain can be shut off. So, okay, here's another one. This is by H.L. Mencken. The value of writing seems to be in inverse proportion to the ease of writing. Whatever flows freely and bubblingly turns out to be sorry stuff a week later. I'll repeat that. The value of writing seems to be in inverse proportion to the ease of writing. Whatever flows freely and bubblingly turns out to be sorry stuff a week later. So I take that to mean that he doesn't trust stuff that happens immediately. Like the stuff that comes out quickly, he doesn't trust. It's the stuff. So as a songwriter, Evan, we'll start with you. Do you trust the stuff that comes out spontaneously, or are you skeptical about those ideas?
No, I think that's the best stuff. The stuff that's labored upon is usually the worst. So it's like the moments where it does come quickly and almost everything falls into place immediately, those are usually the best songs. It's like something about it just locked together and you're able to like tune into this emotion that the song conveyed very easily. And if that all came together with ease, all the parts are hitting in the right spots, usually those are the ones that do the best.
Yeah. Tom, how about you?
Yeah, I like where the quote is coming from, because I kind of I fundamentally object to the idea that in order for something to be good, it has to be this sort of like spark of like divine inspiration or whatever. But I do find that that I there's it's hard to like measure qualitatively like one to the other, but like there are plenty of times where the stuff that came really easily was the best stuff, like for me, definitely, like the stuff that like where it was just like this is like a natural expression, I seem to have to do it, and it's there. There's also examples where I did have to hack at something for a really long time, and I'm really like happy with how it came out. But yeah, I feel like I don't I definitely there's definitely many instances where the kind of the first the things that flow are the things that work.
Yeah. All right, two more questions. First, Tom, will stay with you. What does a song on the new album stand out? What was the most process-wise, the most frustrating song to write? Maybe a song that you wanted to give up on, and because it just wasn't happening, and you're glad that I don't want to. We all have the ones. Everyone's songwriters. They all have the songs that happened within like a minute. I hear those stories all the time, but I love the stories about the ones that, oh my gosh, is this even worth finishing? So, is there one that stood out as being the most labor intensive?
I'm not sure the most like fully labor intensive, but the one that I feel like was like the most like the process that I in some ways like felt best about completing and was like a sort of drawn out one was the main thing, where like I had the first verse I wrote like entirely in like 30 seconds or something. Like, I mean, more than that, but it was like in a few minutes in a car. And then like I was totally stuck on it for like months and months and months and months and months. Like every time I tried to do anything with it, it just wouldn't go anywhere. And I had like that idea for the first verse for like I think like really like a year, like maybe more. And I would come back to it every now and again, and I could just never figure out where it was supposed to go. I could never figure out what was supposed to happen next. Like I could never make it work. And then we were like doing some recording stuff in New York, and I was just kind of like sitting around waiting for like drums to get set up, and started playing with it again. And I got the chorus, like I got through it, and I was like, "That's like, oh man, like that is it. That's the structure. That's how it moves." But I still didn't know what to do with the second verse in particular because it's kind of like just the way the meter works in it and stuff. It's kind of hard to like it's just hard to get to fill the space in the right order while like still like having control of the words basically. And I just couldn't figure out where to go with the second part of it. And then it like 3 or 4 months after that, I figured out the second verse and I figured out how to make it work. And the thing that I kind of like I think found most satisfying about it is that it's like these like both the verses are separate, centered around like two separate like illusions that are like kind of like extrinsic, like they're both like things that I was thinking about a lot at the time that are like very different from each other, and I managed to kind of tie them together. So like the first one was written like in the summer in a car, and so I was thinking about baseball a lot, and it's got like this like baseball thing. And then the second one was like I got the second verse, like I got like really obsessed with this guy Jack Parsons and sort of like the history of like telematic magic, and like that was like where the second one came from. And I was like, these are like this is like an idea and a thing I was trying to say, and I was literally trying to say it for like 18 months, and then eventually I figured out how to do it, and I was like really happy with how all the pieces fit together. And I like that it kind of reflects like two very distinctly different brains, I guess. Like I was I was in one mindset at one time, and like 18 months later, like I was in a totally different one. And it's like this something that connected the two, which is cool.
Yeah. Evan, how about you? Was there a song in the new album that was, that was just the most labor intensive or the hardest one to get through?
It's a good question. I feel like Heavy Bag maybe had a few iterations, but it was more arranging. Like, Tom would always kind of bring a song almost as a folk song at first. And then we kind of turned them into more rock and roll songs. But that one, there's something about the emotion of it that resonated really purely. And it was kind of like, okay, we should try and keep that within this song. So we then were like, let's approach it differently. So there are a few iterations of trying it in different styles and with different forms of rhythms and arrangements. I remember that taking a while, and really just at one point it had too many parts. It was just like hollowing it out and making it more simple was like, okay, this is the essence of what this should be. So I remember that took a while, but we knew it was good. So it was worth spending the time on.
Yeah. All right, last question. Tom, I see books behind you, and I have books behind me. So, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about reading habits. So I do find that songwriters are voracious readers for the most part. So who do you like to read? Are you a genre person, an author person? So let's have at it.
Yeah, like I did a lit degree, so I feel like there was like that has like that has kind of shaped my reading habits in an interesting way, because it's like I spent like 4.5 years like reading the canon and reading a lot of theory and doing this like specific thing, and then I kind of like got like when I like finished school, I kind of went hard in the other direction to an extent. I was just like, you know what, I tried to read every Hugo Award winner, and so I got really like nailed into just doing sci-fi all the time, and I feel like I've only like kind of like gotten back out of genre fiction like relatively recently and been like kind of down to read other stuff. Though it's like always been like, I don't know. I feel like I like end up reading like a Graham Greene novel once a year. But my big one recently actually has been John le Carré. I like kind of had like, I guess because he died was probably why he'd been like in the news a lot, and I'd been hearing about him a lot, and I'd never read anything. And the first thing I picked up was A Perfect Spy, which is like Philip Roth called the greatest British novel since the war.
Yep.
And it's really, really good. like I was really blown away by it. I loved it so much. And I feel like I kind of like, I then basically read like everything else he wrote chasing that high. And there are a bunch of other things he wrote that are fantastic, but I think like that one it really stands out. So that's, le Carré has been very much the sort of center of my my reading world for the last like several months.
See, I'm the total opposite of you. And that is when I finish reading a book, the last thing I want to do is read something else by that author. My first thought is, it's not that I don't like it. I just want to get another voice in my head, which is so funny because I just finished Best American Short Stories Anthology. It's just put out every year by some publisher, and it's 20, 25, whatever different short stories by different authors. And I love kind of, knowing that the next one I'm going to read is going to be very different from the one I just read. So I love the fact that you're the exact opposite of me in that sense.
That's I think like it's not with I mean it's to some extent dependent on how much I enjoyed it. But I do find that like I feel like with Le Carré is a good example of it where it's like he offers a perspective that I had not quite encountered before, and I sort of wanted to see how much his full body of work expresses that perspective. And in his case, it absolutely does. Like I feel like his like entire like his entire sort of like bibliography, like it all almost has like one thesis, which is really cool, and it's interesting to read it back from like sort of like A Perfect Spy, which is I think is like the most developed version of it, and then go back to his early work and be like, oh, like that. No, he was driving at that. He didn't like quite know how to say it yet, but he was like working in that direction.
All right, Evan, how about you?
I tend to read a lot of music biographies, which I'm like lately trying to get myself out of because I feel like I've just read too many of them and the trajectory is kind of very similar in a lot of them. The last one I read was the Sun Ra Space is the Place biography, which is actually really cool and interesting. I tend to read so many rock and roll and punk and things like that, so it was good to read one that wasn't just the same old story. And then I also like Murakami, Camus. I'm reading this book that I bought at an airport the other day by Michael Pollan called This Is Your Mind on Plants.
Oh, I've read I have not read that, but I've read his other books too. He's great.
Yeah, it's so great. It's so interesting. It's like three different essays, one on opium, one on caffeine, and then one on psychedelics. And I'm reading the caffeine one right now and just basically telling the history of coffee while he's going through caffeine withdrawal, trying to see what his life is like without coffee in it.
Interesting. Murakami comes up all the time with songwriters. Good. There are like 4 or 5. I'll tell you, I could probably list them. Murakami, Bukowski, Kurt Vonnegut, Cormac McCarthy. I mean, it's not a surprise. It's all like the brutally efficient, concise writers where there's not one wasted word. And that's it for today's podcast. Don't forget my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Ben Opipari, that is me, comes out June 25th on Hachette Book. It is available for pre-order everywhere, including on my site, songwritersonpodcast.com. Mark is a good friend and one of the guitarists in the band Lamb of God, and we tell one hell of a story about his life. It's a great memoir. Of course, I'm biased, but I'm very excited for all of you to read that. Speaking of the site, songwritersonpodcast.com. That's where you'll find all of the podcast episodes, as well as on all major streaming platforms. The site, the podcast is not that old. It's only, I think, from 2022. Before that, I transcribed all of the interviews in I would say in print, but online. And so there's about 200 interviews with songwriters transcribed on the site as well, just about the songwriting process. If you want to read them, they are also there. And I'm always open for suggestions, comments, complaints. Who would you like me to interview? Email me at ben@songwritersonprocess.com or go to the form on the website, fill it out, and I will try to get back to you. I always love hearing from you and your suggestions. So until next time, everyone, have a great day.